Hi there and welcome to a tutorial on the updated in-betweening feature in Cascadeur 2025.3. In this update we introduce in-betweening as a type of interpolation, which means it can now update in real time and can be used with other interpolation methods. So in this scene we basically have three poses of Cassie sitting on the chair, standing up, and then another one standing at the bar. So let's now select the interval between the keyframes and choose in-betweening as the interpolation type. It is now located in the interpolation bar above the timeline. We can now see the animation being instantly generated between those keyframes. We can delete the keyframes or add more to specify the animation. Here, if I delete the keyframe of Cassie standing up, you will see the animation instantly change. They're now like literally sprinting towards the bar. So let's return that keyframe. Same if you were to change the pose in that keyframe, you will see the animation update on the go. That gives you an opportunity to play around with the keyframes and the poses in them, specifically the poses themselves, as the poses will heavily influence the animation generated between them. Now say we want to create some animation here of Cassie drinking. By the way, I will show you how to set up the constraints for the soda can at the end of the video. So what we have here is Cassie grabbing the can, drinking it, and then returning to the idle pose. So I created all those keyframes for the animation and now interpolated using Bezier clamped. Now because there's a lot of rotation involved in the movement, we want to set the interpolation type to FK for specific body parts. Now when you open the tracks for the character, you may notice that the contents looks different. This separation provides better results with the new in-betweening system. If we compare it to the character rigged in the older versions of Cascadeur, you will notice that the tracks are different there, so we highly recommend updating your rig first. The easiest way would be to go to the rig mode and use the quick rigging tool and generate the rig. So, back to our scene, we want to change the interpolation of Cassie's right arm, head and torso to FK. Now for the rest of the body tracks, I want to use in-betweening. So I will delete the keyframes for them and switch their interpolation type to in-betweening. However, by doing so, you may notice that Cassie starts moving and the animation that we created looks broken and misaligned. And this is probably something that we've never mentioned on our channel. This happens because the keyframes themselves, by default, are IK. And the same way as we set interpolation to IK or FK, we can do it for the keyframes themselves. This panel to the left is where you can do this. You can apply changes either to the current frame or to any amount of frames selected on the timeline. So I'm going to select that animation interval and set the keyframes there to FK. Now if you zoom in, you will notice that those keyframes will be marked as FK on the timeline as well. So basically what it does, it sets the poses relative to the parents. Now these keyframes sort of exist in relative space. The arm is now posed relative to the chest instead of being somewhere in the global space. And now when the character starts moving, you see that the animation follows. I will showcase more examples on the FK keyframes later in this video. Now let's create another keyframe and get Cassie to walk somewhere all while still drinking. As you can see, we can preserve the animation despite the character even rotating in the space. Now, another point here is that we can create additional keyframes within in-betweening interpolation to specify certain poses. Like here for example, I want to prevent the hand from going through the surface of the bar. So I create an additional keyframe and adjust the pose there. I'm also going to switch the interpolation for the fingers on that interval. So this hopefully gives you an idea of how you can set up your scene to use in-betweening with other types of interpolations. Another little thing to note here is that you can also switch between IK and FK interpolation for the in-betweening itself. Now here I'm noticing that the left arm looks overstretched, so we can set its interpolation to FK, and in this case it starts to look better. So we encourage you to play around with your animation, be free to add and remove keyframes, change the poses, and when you're happy with the results you can unbake the animation and get to polishing. Another important moment is that you can use AutoPhysics straight away. In this animation here you can see that we used Inbetweening for pelvis and legs, but we interpolated arms and torso to preserve a specific pose. And you can see that without physics the pose looks quite rigid. Using secondary motion and other physics filters can bring more life to the animation. Also, AutoPhysics corrects the ballistic trajectory for the character's center of mass, which makes the result look much better. So as for the pipeline, we would definitely recommend a physics pass for the animation that you generate with Inbetweening. So here's another example of how FK keyframes work. In this running animation, at some point I want Cassie to start praying that this version of Cascadeur with a rendering engine does not crash. And now if I want them to start praying sooner, the most instinctive way would be to just move the keyframe. This happens because the default IK keyframes create the pose somewhere in the global space. By changing the keyframes to FK, we sort of preserve the pose relative to its parents. For the arms here, relative to the torso. And now if we move the keyframe, you will see that the pose will move with it. This way we can copy the keyframes and move them along the timeline, making sure that the pose does not break. Here I also changed the interpolation for the arms to FK. You don't have to, however, set FK interpolation for the torso, unless you wanted to inherit the rotation of the pelvis. In most cases, IK interpolation for the torso works much better. And here I noticed that I forgot to set up the keyframes for the fingers. So, in a word, using FK keyframes allows you to retain the position for specific body parts relative to their parents. Here's another example. I got this animation from Mixamo, so import the FBX, get the T-pose for rigging, select the joints, go to Commands, Transform, go to Model Pose. Do that on the very first frame of the animation, then go to the rig mode and generate the rig. This in turn will create the necessary tracks for the character. So what I want to do is I want to keep the animation for the upper body of the character and then in between the lower part. So I'm going to select all the keyframes for the head, arms and torso and set the keyframes to FK. And I'm going to delete the rest and replace it with Inbetweening. I didn't have to delete the keyframes for the fingers though, so yeah. Anyways, with this setup we can now move the character in the last frame of the animation and see what happens. You can also add more keyframes in the middle to specify their position. And now lastly, as I promised, I'm going to show you how I set up the constraint for the can. So if we try to move the hand, the can obviously does not move with it. The only thing I have in the scene is the can geometry. So here's one of the ways that you can set up a constraint. Go to Commands, Add Joint. Now I'm going to move the joint into the can folder on the timeline to keep the tracks arranged. Now copy the global position of the can, select the joint and paste its position. Now let's rename the joint in the outliner and then drop the soda can on top of it. This way the joint now controls the can. Now let's set a keyframe for the can and the joint on frame 100. To set up a constraint, select the joint of the can, shift select the hand joint or whatever joint you want to constrain it to, go to Command, Constrain, Transform. Now in the pop-up window, select the parent joint. Now if we move the hand, nothing happens, because you have to activate the constraint on the keyframe. So select the soda can joint and in the object properties under constraint, set the constraint active. you have to activate the constraints on the keyframes and on the interpolation separately. So that's it. Hope it was useful. Like, comment and subscribe, and see you in the next one. Happy in betweening, y'all! Cheers!